Happy Tuesday, Mental Health Warriors. I'm glad you tuned in. I'm super excited about the show tonight. I have a good friend of mine who I served with in the military, who is still currently in the military. I got Sergeant Major Tom Campbell. He's a great friend. Not only that, he was my great fishing buddy. We did a lot of fishing down there at Fort Eustis and really enjoyed it. But he's got a really powerful story. And now this is Mental Health Awareness Month, May is. And being a mental health warrior, is really happy to have him come on and tell his story of hope. It's much similar to my story of hope. And Tom and I, and he'll talk about this. We've spent hours sitting on the boat talking about our different life experiences and having the courage to come forward, especially in uniform, because it's hard when you're in uniform. And anybody who's listening to this podcast who is still in uniform, just know that it's okay to ask for help. But if you're listening to this podcast and you're in uniform, just know that the military does care about you. They do want you to ask for help. And, you know, you can go on and have a successful military career. And with that, Tom, I just want you to kind of chime in and go ahead and tell us your story a little bit. I know you have a very powerful story. You do speak about it. And just kind of introduce yourself and let everybody know in the mental health warrior and the Veterans Trash Talk community who Tom Campbell is.
Hey, I appreciate it, Cliff. Hey, yeah, so, I mean, my story started, I mean, I was a senior non-commissioned officer, and I had back-to-back deployments, and so, but I had kind of had a stigma against mental health. I mean, I grew up in an army where it was frowned upon. If you went to mental health, it meant you was trying to get out of something. It meant you was kind of the weasels that went to mental health.
Yep.
And so then we started deployments. I mean, we went to war, and people started having issues, and then our suicide rate started going up. And so we started looking at mental health, but we still had a stigma out there, a strong stigma. And in my case, I had a persona that somehow I was invincible with mental health issues.
Yeah.
So my story started actually when I started with my fourth deployment, and then I ended up go to the Sergeant Major Academy at Fort Bliss, Texas. And a couple of things what kind of started down this slippery slope was before going to Fort Bliss on back-to-back deployments was I was either just getting back from a deployment and then we're recovering and we're ready to go out on deployment. And I was in charge of people and people in charge of me, and I had people around me all the time and what have you. Is now I go to the Sergeant Major Academy and I pull my little travel trailer down there and I'm down there by myself. And the idle mind is the devil's playground.
Yep. And
so I get down there to back up a little bit. I also find out that I have a marriage that's going south. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I had redeployed from Afghanistan and I had a brain injury. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Right towards the end of that deployment, I go back to Alaska. 2 weeks later, I'm headed south with my little travel trailer in tow to go to Fort Bliss, Texas. But some of the things over those deployments, I had some issues with some survivor guilt. I started questioning some of the decisions that I made and some of the actions that I took. I had a 20-year marriage, just went down to drink. I had an estranged relationship with my kids. I had a perfect credit score that also went down the drink with that divorce. And so kind of my life was crumbling around me. But I still thought I could figure this out. Eventually I'll figure this thing out and get myself back on track. Well, the other problem I was having these migraine headaches. I would sitting there and all of a sudden this headache would come on and it would hurt so bad I couldn't move. I couldn't move my eyeballs even. And so I started self-medicating, and I thought Jim Beam was a pretty good doctor. I'll tell you what, he sucks as a doctor.
He does.
And so I started self-medicating, and I'd do some stupid stuff too that I never knew about. I'd get a headache. I'd schedule an appointment with Jim Beam. I'd have a doctor session with him, and then I'd go out and do stupid stuff like ride a wheelie on my Harley out of the trailer park at 3 o'clock in the morning and stuff that people would tell me about the next day, and I didn't even remember riding a stupid thing. But But then I actually was suicidal before I knew I was suicidal. And here's what I mean by that. One, I was bitter. I hated everybody. And I had burnt just damn near every bridge and every friendship I had. I was mad at myself. I was mad at God. I was mad at the world. I hated everybody, and I did not care. I didn't care for my health, nor did I care for anybody else's well-being around me. And so I ended up having an episode in class, and I had to go see the commandant at the time, and he kind of sparked the idea in me. I mean, I'd always, as a leader, I'd always preached to lead by example, not by a word. And he said something to me. He had asked me the question, how many people? Well, actually, he made me go see mental health. And when I went into mental health that time, after my explosion I had in class, the little lady that in tennis shoes that I saw, and I don't know I cannot remember her name, but if I ever meet the gal, I'll get on my knees and apologize to her, because I went in with an attitude.
Yeah.
And I was made such a spectacle of myself that she refused to be in the same room with me because she feared for her health. And so then I had to go see the commandant. And the commandant had asked me a question. He goes, "Hey, you know why I made you go see mental health?" I said, "Yeah, Roger, because I told somebody to go screw himself and the rest of the class, and I stormed and I went home." He said, "Well, no." He said, "But I mean, that wasn't professional." He said, "But how many NCOs have you forced to get help with all the deployments that you've got?" And that's what registered, because I had forced people to get help. And then I got thinking, you idiot, you're showing the same symptoms and signs that you look for in your guys when they. So I said, all right, I'm gonna give this an honest effort. So my next psychiatrist was a guy, a really big guy, like taller than I am, really broad, and but he was on his way out of Fort Bliss. I had a couple of sessions with him, and then he hooked me up with another little old lady in tennis shoes, Miss Pierce. And I will tell you what, Miss Pierce was good. And she drug stuff out of me I didn't even know was buried in there. Yeah. But she picked up on TBI and asked me if I'd ever been screened on TBI. And I said, well, no, why would I? I mean, my head, I don't have any holes in there. And I mean, I got my bell rung a couple of times and smashed my head. But I think I'm all right. And at the same time, during this time, I couldn't talk good. I forget words when I talk. I still do sometimes. And then I would get confused, and then I just tell you to go screw yourself, and I'd walk off. And so I go to the TBI clinic there on Fort Bliss, and they do MRIs and all that good stuff, and test my motor skills, memory skills, and all that crap. And the doc says, well, here's the deal, guy. Your front left lobe is bruised, like that whole lobe is like it's just a big bruise. He said, that'll heal over time. He said, but in that bruise, you got dead tissue about the size of a $50. And he said, that's not going to heal. That's just dead tissue. And probably what caused that is probably, I mean, if you can remember the worst headache you had after one of your head injuries. Oh, wow. Yeah, I can't remember that. I mean, I've had a bunch of headaches, and normally the recent ones I had, Jim Beam took care of them for me. But he said, but evidently during one of those injuries, I had an aneurysm. And so that clot just kind of killed that tissue, and it's just dead tissue. It'll never heal back. So right now, I'm as good as I'm going to get. But that is what that's actually what broke the camel's back for me. Is on top of all that other stuff I talked about, survivor guilt and divorce and finance issues and isolation and all strange relationship with my kids and all that stuff. On top of that, I'm retarded. And in my mind there's no way that they're going to let me be a sergeant major, and they're probably going to kick me out of the Army, and there's not much of a job market out there for retarded people, and I'm just going to be retarded the rest of my life. And I ain't going to be able to take care of my kids now because I ain't going to be able to have a job. And so I said, you know, screw this. I think it's time. And that's when I said, you know what, I can make sure I can set my kids up for success and make sure they're taken care of if I die. All my stressors will be gone. And I really thought the world was going to be a better place if I wasn't in it. I had taken blame for everything that was wrong around me. And so that's when I came up with a plan. And I rehearsed that plan. I resourced that plan. And once I had a solid plan, I ain't going to lie to you, I had a sense of relief that I hadn't experienced in years. And so I'm having a TBI moment now. I can't remember where I was going with that.
Yeah, hey, Tom, real quick, I want to say that, you bring up a good point that, once that doctor had diagnosed you with, dead tissue in the brain from an aneurysm that you had that you didn't realize you had, one thing they teach in master resiliency training, right, is not to catastrophize stuff. And that's exactly what you did. I mean, you immediately associated you forgetting words to being retarded, and you're far from retarded, Tom. You're a very intelligent man. I've spent a lot of time with you, and I don't say that lightly because you are. Now, you may not be able to get your words out the way you want to get them out, but that doesn't mean that you're stupid by any means. But, that's one of the techniques that we teach in master resiliency training is not to take that information and go down the road that you went down. And now that you've done that and you went down that road, now that you're making your plan, you're ready to execute your plan. And just like you said, you are feeling better now because in your mind, and I was the same way, you start feeling those weights being lifted off your chest, right? And so you're getting lighter and lighter because now at this certain point in time, you won't have to worry about that stuff anymore and everybody be taken care of. And so you can go ahead and finish your story. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things. I mean, TBI clinic, or TBI treatment. They prescribed me a bunch of medicines. One so I don't bounce around like a stupid idiot, and one to help me sleep, one to lessen the headaches. And I have my little magic pill when I have a headache come on. I take that thing, boy, it'll knock a headache out quick.
Yeah.
And then just my old man pills. Just arthritis and thyroid issues and all the heartburn, all that stuff just old people get. But I hate medicine. And they subscribed me all this medicine to try to get my chemical balances in right and I never took them because I hated it. Jim Beam was working, I thought. Yeah. Jim Beam was doing just fine. I'd stayed with Jim Beam. What does these quacks know over here? Jim Beam. He's been around for 100 years.
I laugh, but you're right. I was the same way. So I was Scotch. I wasn't Jim Beam.
And that's why I'm trying to make light of it. But when I got to the point of suicide, and I'll tell you, my suicide attempt was I needed an accident. I didn't want to jeopardize my kid's future by just sticking a barrel in my mouth and pulling the trigger, or hanging myself, or any of it. So I had staged a motorcycle accident.
Yeah.
And I had the perfect place to stage it and what have you. Now, and if anybody's been out there in El Paso on Trans Mountain Road coming down into the East El Paso, there's a sharp curve with some picnic tables and rock walls, and the plan was make it look like I missed a curve and smack one of them rock walls on my motorcycle, and then that'd be it. And so, but I go up to the top of the mountain. When I'm coming down, between the trip up and back down, somebody parked a car at the end of that wall. And so in my mind, I could picture hitting the car. With my luck, I go over the side of the mountain, break my neck, and then I'll be a paraplegic, and then I would bail off myself if I wanted to, and I'd be pooping in a diaper and eating in a straw the rest of my life.
Right.
And so somehow I got that motorcycle under control and went around that curve sideways with tires smoking. Got that motorcycle stopped, and I went up and I parked on the side of the road where I could see that car and wait for them to leave. And that's when the intervention happened. And so when I'm sitting there on the side of the road waiting for that car to leave, my phone rings in my pocket. And I am not going to answer this thing because I'm on a mission.
Mm-hmm.
And it rings and rings and rings, and then it stops. And then it rings and rings and rings, and then it stops. And then it rings and rings. And so after the fourth time, I said, oh, well, whoever this is persistent. So I pulled my phone out and I answered the phone. And the person on the other end of that line was this little girl that I had met at the VFW. And for some reason, she just couldn't believe I was as ornery as a person as I put on to be. And there had to be a good heart somewhere buried down inside of all that hate that I portrayed at the time. And she always kept talking to me. And I even said rude stuff to her too, but she always kept talking to me. Mm-hmm. And she just had this weird feeling that she needed to call and just check, see how I was doing. And then when she called and it went to voicemail, she wasn't going to accept that. She called again and it went to voicemail. And she said, if you ask her, she'll tell you she would have done that all damn day until I answered that stupid phone. And so she literally talked me off the ledge or off the mountain that day. And so once she got me off the mountain, then I don't know, it's like an epiphany, I guess. I'm like, fuck, I've got to get this shit together.
Yeah.
And I told this story to all the TRADOC senior leaders just not too long ago. And General Funk, the TRADOC commander, asked me, what was it that Teresa told you on the mountain that made you change your plans? And I told him, I said, sir, nobody's ever asked me that before, and I don't know. I cannot tell you what it was. I can't even remember that conversation because my mind was so distraught at the time. And Jim Beam was in there too, that I don't know. I can't put anything right there on what that conversation was. But here's what I think, because when I got home, I talked to Teresa about it. And here's what we think. It's not what she said. It's just the fact that she said something.
Yeah. The tone of her voice, probably.
And because what it made me realize, and this way I always get, kind of emotional when I think about it, is, I thought nobody cared. I thought nobody loved me. I didn't love anybody. And but the fact that she kept talking to me, but she called me and it kind of planted the seed that somebody out there gives a heck about me. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think it's what she said. I think it's just the fact that she said. Yeah. And so
all act of kindness can go a long ways in a lot of people's lives. I say that all
it is. And and one thing I took out of that is intuition. And even now, if somebody starts weighing on my mind, I'm gonna reach out to them. Just say, hey.
Yeah.
And you don't know what's going on the other end of that phone or text or however you communicate with them.
Yeah. Well, my brother was the same way. He was at work and I was at home and he called and I didn't answer. I was already on my path to dying when he had called. But had he not got that funny feeling and wanted to rushed home, he left work. He ran out of work. He was only a mile away from home and found me unconscious on the couch. And had he not had that intuition, like you talk about, Tom, you and I both wouldn't be here having this conversation because we would have completed.
No, you're right.
And doing it. And people ask me all the time, when I wrote that note, we talked about this, what did I feel like? And I said, well, for the first time in a year, I felt peace because all the pain that I was feeling, I thought would go away with my death. In reality, it doesn't ever go away. But you bring up a good point. We talked about this earlier about the coupling effect. Teresa, when she called you, she broke that coupling effect. you were ready to die and you were going to execute your plan, and everything in your mind had come together at that moment. And she was the
Right.
one thing that broke that. I didn't have that. Luckily, my brother found me in time to save my life. But if any of these soldiers out there or civilians or anybody who's listening to this, if you get that intuition, you get that feeling, you talked about this, Tom, pick up that phone and call somebody. I've done that I don't know how many times. Random people on Instagram or Facebook will post something, and I don't know them from Adam, but I'll say something. The Black Bear Diner had this thing where they called it random acts of kindness they did on Instagram. And I ate their diner a couple of times when I did speaking events in California. And I talk about this. Tom, as well as I do, when you do speaking events, it wears on you and you get mentally tired, but you think it's important, so you push through. Right. And so I just find things for self-care. So I just went to the Black Bear Diner just to have chicken fried steak and mashed potatoes, because to me that's comfort food. And I tweeted about on Instagram. I took pictures of it and posted it, and we've communicated since then. And it's just that simple act of kindness. And then they had this whole campaign where they were talking about, and I talked about this one on a podcast, the act of kindness, and they sent me a T-shirt and stuff. But who knows in how many people's lives that small act of kindness actually save somebody's life. You don't know. You may not know.
Yeah.
And I was the good morning guy when I used to go into work because I love my job. And I would say good morning to everybody. You know that, Tom. Even at IMT, when I worked at IMT with you, I would always talk to everybody in the morning. And you and I, there was a couple of times where you were, kind of not in a good mood. And I, say, hey, Tom, what's going on? You don't seem quite right. And you would do the same thing for me. It goes both ways. Right. But I think that intuition you bring up is very important. And it's very important to have that real talk with your, not only I think leaders need to talk among leaders, but also when you have that real talk with your subordinates is very important, about the importance of not only, I'm not talking about telling them to ask for help. I'm saying that if they have an intuition about one of their fellow soldiers, to pick up that phone and call them. And I say this all the time in my speaking events. I don't care what you think at that moment in time that you don't think you're important to somebody, but I guarantee you're important to somebody. They love you and they want you here tomorrow. And don't be like Cliff Bauman and pick up that phone and give them a call, because I guarantee you they'll want to answer it and they want to help you. Because I didn't.
Yeah, and I tell you, I mean, and it's Cliff. I mean, when you're the one in crisis, I mean, you can define crisis 1,000 different ways, but
yeah,
it's kind of hard to reach out. I mean, like me, there's no way I would have called anybody. I would not have called a suicide hotline. There's no way I would have called a friend, which I didn't have any at the time. I would not have called a family member, because in my mind, I thought that's what needed to happen to make the world better. I needed to go away because I was the reason why the world was not a good place to live. Yeah. And reality, it was all in my head, that if Tom's world was not a good place to live with Tom in it.
Same thing with
not the world.
Yeah.
But I cannot stress the importance, though, of others reaching out there. And how do you do that? I mean, it goes back to, you have to build that trust and confidence.
Yeah.
With your peers and subordinates, to be able to have that open dialogue, to build reach out. Of course, when you deploy together, I mean, you build a brotherhood that's a bond that's a real tight knit bond. But heck, I've got guys, when I was a squad leader, I've got guys that still stay in contact with me.
Yeah.
And definitely as a first sergeant, but reaching out is, I mean, there's a lot. There's no way to kind of express the influence of just reaching out to somebody, just saying hi, and open that dialogue. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we talked earlier about, I mean, if you do intervene, you own that problem till it's not a problem for that person. And I've got a great example of that. So 2 years ago now, I can't believe how much time's gone by, I was a brigade sergeant major down there at Fort Stewart. And one of my senior NCOs, some first class, was in bad place. And his wife had got his phone and had looked. So happened, I was the last one that had talked to this guy, and it was about work related.
Mm-hmm.
And she just called the last number on his phone, which happened to be my phone. And I was in the brigade commander's office. And so she said, I'm not going to say his name, but this is Miss So-and-so, and somebody's got to need to come over here and get Sergeant So-and-so. So I told Colonel Larkwood, the brigade commander, I said, hey, sir, we got an NCO on crisis. I got to go. And so I went straight over to their house. And I intervened with this guy. I mean, when I got there, this dude had been drinking all night and all day, hadn't eaten nothing. So all he had in his body was alcohol. And I mean, he was in bad shape, and he was sitting there he was ready to off it. He was ready to off himself. So when I talked the gun out of his hand, and I sat down next to him, and I just sat there and I let him vent, and I talked, and then I finally got him to put a shirt on and put him in the truck, and I drove him down to the ER because now it's nighttime. And because he's drunk, they can't have a psychiatrist come in and talk to him. So I got to sit in the drunk room with him because I'm the one that took him there. So I spent all Friday night in there with him. Saturday morning, finally he passes out. Friday morning, they finally bring somebody in and talk to him, and the psychiatrist recommended he doesn't go back home, but he stays with somebody to monitor him. So I took him to my house. Teresa cooked something, fed him to get some food in him to try to absorb some of the alcohol, put him to bed. And so the next day, or actually it was that evening, we're sitting on the porch. And he just started opening up to me. And I'll tell you what, this guy has freaking amazing. I mean, when you talk about the poster child for resiliency, that's this guy. And so the end of that story is he told me stuff he had never told anybody else.
Yeah.
And 2 years later, I still talk to that guy because he's a lot better now. And his life is turning around. He's doing great. He's still working through his issues. So his issues are still my issues because I'm the one that intervened. Yeah. And I could have called his battalion sergeant major. I could have got his first sergeant. I could have, but because it came to me and I could hear him in the background and knew we didn't have time to go try to track people down or what have you. And I went straight there to stop him from committing the act. Yeah. But because I was that guy that intervened 2 years later, and I still own that problem. Yeah. And I still talk to the guy, and I've been there his whole way through treatment. I've been by his side. And that's the part we don't talk about when we start talking about suicide awareness and prevention.
Well, that's one of the things, the Nick and his buddies, that's why they founded Veterans Trash Talk. So veterans would have a place, and even soldiers, you don't have to be a veteran, will have a place to go out and talk and vent about those issues that they may not talk with anybody else about. And you're right, Tom, when somebody tells you something that's deep and personal to them, you own it. Some people can handle that information. And I tell people all the time, if somebody tells you something and it makes you uncomfortable, it's okay to go and ask somebody for help or to maybe better help you understand that so you can better help that person, and it's because some people that's hard to take sometimes. As well as I do, Tom, when you go out and do speaking events and people come up and talk to you after your speaking event, it's not always the best stories they tell you, but it's their story. And it's my responsibility to listen to them and give them the time and the caring they need because they chose you to tell that story to. And, you're a good guy, Tom. You've been down that road, and it was very important for you to make sure that soldier went and saw and got the help that he needed.
I mean, when I was down there at South Carolina, the day 3 down there, and one of the drill sergeant leaders of Drill Sergeant Academy shot himself. And after we got through we worked the whole thing, is during the fatality after action review board, well, yeah, it was during the after action, not the actual suicide review board, but the loss of life after action and or fatality after action. I said, but yeah, somebody brought up a comment that I mean, yeah, I mean, so I mean, we're planning on doing a memorial service for him, but does he actually deserve a memorial? And then I kind of lost it on him, on the guy, because that's exactly that's the problem we've got out there. Is that still stigma? Because what I told him, I said, you know, guys, here's the bottom line. You don't know what the hell went through that Sergeant First Class's head when he pulled that fucking trigger. No. And what you don't know is what was going on in his life before he got to that point.
Yeah.
And what you don't know that I do know is that some gun had a plan for a while.
Yeah.
I don't know what the trigger was for the timestamp, but he had a plan. And so you coming up with a stupid comment like that is because I guarantee you, and that's one thing with in all the suicide review boards I've sat on, one thing that's common was that, well, there's a whole lot of common things, but one thing I picked up on was once somebody makes a plan, there's kind of a sigh of relief there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And but one thing that was common across all, when you start peeling the onions back and you start interviewing or get those the close, I mean, peers, loved ones, what have you, was that in their mind, they, and in mine too, and when I was at that point, in their mind, they were selflessly coming up with that plan. And that's why I jump on people when they start saying that's a selfish act. How can he be so damn selfish? You know, that's not it. Is in my mind, I legitimately thought that my kids would be better off if I was dead.
Well,
and I thought that everybody around me would be better off if I was dead.
You know,
when it wasn't to satisfy my intent, I was actually going to do that in my stupid mind. I mean, my mind wasn't right.
Well, you know, and you know, Tom, as well as I do, is you know, like you, but you know, had my brother not found me, I would have died. I mean, let's face it, I went close to Z without completing as you can get. And I talk about this when I was in the uniform, and I talk about this now on my podcast whenever I do speaking events. We have to get the soldiers before they get to that point. Because once I got to that point, or anybody in general, once I wrote that note, nothing is going to stop me. You know?
Yeah, you know.
I didn't have the strength, or I wasn't even thinking, to be honest with you. And you know this, Tom. You and I had a long conversation. I was tired. I was done. To me, the fight was over, and I threw in the towel. And you know, once you get to that point, there's no going back. And people say, oh, well, you could just pick up the phone and call, or you could have done this, you could have done that. And you talk about, you know, your girlfriend at the time, wife now, that called you at that moment when you're on top of that hill. It wouldn't have mattered. You know, I don't know if I would have answered the phone, to be honest with you, because I was to that point. And they call it a coupling effect, right? So it's a trigger that's different for everybody. And once you get to that point where everything couples together, a psychologist was talking about this when I was having a conversation with her after a speaking event, is, you know, it's hard to break that, you know, once it happens. And it's different for everybody. And that's the struggle that we struggle with in the service, and struggle with this in civilian life is, you know, what is that one thing that we can do to keep that coupling from happening? And it's different for everybody. And you bring up a good point, you know, when the whole service thing about suicide came up, and Tom, you know, you and I dealt with this, and we talked about this for a long time, and I'm shocked that it still goes on, and it shouldn't, because really in reality, you're not celebrating the person's suicide, you're celebrating that person's life to give their family and loved ones and fellow soldiers closure that they need. We know that, and we know that's important. But I think for some to look at it, there's too much inward inflection on themselves, right? So in my experience, both in uniform and out, when somebody is reflecting that way, it's because they're having their own internal issues and own internal struggles. And that's becomes part of the problem. And that you fight with. And then, of course, you know as well as I do, Tom, in the military, you're fighting stigma with leaders, some good, some bad, right? Some support it, some don't. That's how it is. But the issue is that when you get down to the soldier level, if they feel that way, it's hard for them to go and ask and get the help that they need or pick up that phone and make that call. And that's why I do what I do. That's why you do what you do. And that's why Kevin, my producer, does what he does in supporting, mental health warrior and veterans trash talk. We don't want them to be another statistic. We want them to go and get help. And I understand fully what it's like to feel helpless. And you understand that, Tom. You got to that point.
So it's the way we've done suicide prevention over the years is we've beat that horse till it's dead. And now every time you say suicide prevention training, it immediately turns people off. That's why I renamed my my presentation help seeking behaviors, because it turns everybody off. But the other part is what we don't talk about is our leaders, and not just leaders, or even our peers, or just people. Is we train our society to look for the signs of suicide, look for the symptoms. And if you look for the signs, you're too late. You missed it. We've got to get our leaders to identify crisis.
Yeah.
And you can take that outside of the Army, put it in any organization out there in the world.
Yep.
Any corporation, company, or group, or veterans organization, I don't care. School is, we've got to be able to identify crisis. How do we do that? We do it by personal relationships with our peers and subordinates. Yeah. But the other thing you said, Cliff, is once, and this is something I cannot stress, and we don't talk about this. And this is one thing I picked up after sitting on a bunch of suicide review boards, is once the plan is made, the symptoms are gone.
Yeah.
And that was the same in my case. Is once I had a plan made, and I resourced it, I rehearsed it, I reconned it, and I rehearsed it. And once I had a solid plan that was going to execute, there's nothing you could have done to phase me. I was living in my travel trailer. My travel trailer could have burned to the ground. Somebody could have stole my truck. Stole my dog. I would not have cared, because I knew when my timestamp expired that all my stress and everything's going to go away. My kids are going to be taken care of. Everything that I've been stressing over is going to go away, and it will be fixed as soon as and the reason I had a timestamp, well, I had stuff I had to do. I had to take care of stuff before I passed, to take care of the kids and what have you. And but once I had everything in place, I'm telling you, there's not one thing you could have done to me that would have affected me at all. And I was happy. I had a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in a very long time.
Well, because you know that the pain that you're feeling, that's real to you, right? And I tell people this all the time. With PTSD, it's real to you, and it's the most vivid dream you ever had in your life. And it's different for everybody. It's not the same for the same. You and I could be in the same experience, Tom, and it could affect me differently than it affects you, but that doesn't make it any less.
Oh, yeah.
That person or what they're going through. And I think that's the hard thing for people to struggle with, especially in the uniform. If I'm supposed to be a soldier and same to left and right of the person next to me, and they're not bothered by what I'm going through, then what's wrong with me, and why is that bothering me? And people have to realize that that's normal. We're all made differently. Our minds are made differently, and we deal with trauma in different ways. I had a guest on my show not too long ago, Rachel, who's a life coach, and she talks about that, how people deal with trauma differently. And if you had suffered trauma as a child, then when you suffer trauma as an adult, it affects you differently than if you didn't suffer trauma as a child and you suffered it now as an adult. And I think that's very important when we go out and as leaders and commanders, when you're looking at your squad or your team or your section or your company, your battalion, your brigade or whatever, it's very important to know your soldiers, or have your soldiers know your other soldiers, right? And people talk all the time, well, they don't talk to them face to face, they just text and they just, but you know what? That's how people communicate nowadays, the younger generation texting. And you can get a lot of information out of texting, a lot of information out of social media, if you just take the second to pay attention to what their words mean and what they're actually talking about. And I think sometimes we forget that.
Yeah, that's you're actually right on. And this was something I said when I was at Fort Stewart. And Fort 3rd Infantry Division had a suicide, and in the room was all brigade commanders, sergeant majors, and above. And that was one of the things one of the sergeant majors had brought up was, I mean, social media, I mean, nobody talks to people, and this isn't the height of COVID too. So half the people are working at home and what have, or teleworking and what have you. Is, we're not checking on our people, and there's no way to get around, and yeah. And I told her, I said, you know what? Yeah, the problem is all the graybeards sitting in here in the damn room because we're digital immigrants. The digital natives out there, that's the norm to them. I said, what the problem is, we are our own problem, and we need to figure out how to monopolize this instead of fighting.
Yeah.
And I got this idea. So I asked one of the OC team leaders, who was a captain. I said, how many times have you talked to every member of your team yesterday? He said, I don't know, probably about 12 times. 12 times. Everybody. He said, roger that, Sergeant Major. Every one of them, 12 times yesterday. Huh. How did you do that? Through messaging, texting, whatever.
Yeah.
And I got to thinking, I remember when I was a first sergeant, and me and my commander, the captain, I bet you I probably would have talked to the company, not one-on-one, but I would have talked to them maybe once a day, the whole company. And that was in the morning. We're doing accountability formation before we do PT.
Yeah. And
we didn't have cell phones and all this stuff we got now. But leaders now, they are engaged all the time with their people.
Yeah. And
so us long-bearded, long-toothed people, we got to figure out how to monopolize this damn thing.
Yeah.
And use it. So granted, it doesn't take the place of looking a fella in the eye, because you get a lot out of body language. More so, body speaks more than voice does.
The problem with that,
so it doesn't take it out. But
the problem with that is you and I and the long tooth people, we understand that. The younger generation doesn't know how to read body language as well as we do, because
I agree with you.
One-on-one communication isn't the same, and I think that's part of the challenge too. It's twofold, but you're absolutely right. Is social, and I talk about this. Social media has gotten a bad rap, but social media can be used for good. And I bring an example of, I wrote an article, or I do writings for Rally Point, right? And so a lot of mine get millions of likes and things. But one guy was talking about his, brother who had completed suicide. This is after Vietnam, and he didn't complete. He attempted, and then he wound up being paralyzed and a whole bunch of other bad things. But he told me that he appreciated my article, and he wished his brother would have known somebody like me, because maybe his path would have been different. And I wrote back, and I told him, thanks, and I thanked him and his brother for his service and stuff. And so, as we do these podcasts and as we talk on social media and things like this, and Tom, and you start educating people there, that it can be used for the good too, because people listen to podcasts, people go to TikTok, people go to Instagram, people go to Twitter, people go to all these things for all their different information. And if you're not touching all of those, you're missing somebody. Just the way it is.
Yeah, I completely agree. But here's one thing though that I picked up, and this one, because a lot of people, they'll bring up the whole personal relationship issue. And one though, the personal, and I think you said it earlier, just saying hi. One is, so let me back up before I contradict myself. So just saying hi, you never know how much of an impact that is. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit about intuitions, but it's not enough. I mean, just walking into among your peers and your subordinates and just saying, hey, that doesn't mean that you've got the trust and confidence.
Right.
And so how do you get that trust and confidence? And that's one thing that everybody talks about. One is there's 3 traits. I mean, there's a bunch of traits you need to have, but there's 3 traits you got to have. One, you got to be open. And what I mean by open is available. You've got to be available where people can talk to you. But you've got to be honest. As soon as you break honesty, you've broke all trust out there. And then you've got to be transparent too.
Yeah.
That's how you gain the trust of your peers and subordinates, is by being open, honest, and transparent on that. So some people do it quite naturally. Some people it's hard to do, and some people can't do it at all.
Yep.
And when I started looking at who's who out of those groups, what I found out was those that do it naturally seem to are confident leaders and are confident people. The ones that it's hard to do it, they'll eventually do it. It's just a little harder to warm up to them, and that's our introverts.
Yeah.
Nothing against them either, because what I did find out is our introverts seem to be more passionate than our extroverts.
Yeah.
And a surprising fact a lot of people don't know is a lot of our general officers, actually 90+% of our general officers are extreme introverts.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why they are is because they're so freaking passionate about what they do, and they're passionate about those around them.
Yeah.
But the ones that can't do it at all tend to be our incompetent leaders. And the reason, and then when I started trying to figure out why is that, it's because I found out that they've got to keep a divide between them and their peers and subordinates for fear of being exposed.
Yeah.
And surprisingly, those are also ones that tend to be our experts. Not all of our experts are incompetent, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But a lot of our incompetent leaders tend to be experts. They can quote regs and they can quote, I mean,
yeah,
they try to be the smartest person in the room,
because that knowledge to them hides their shortcomings.
Exactly.
In their mind.
It's a defense mechanism for them. Yeah. But if you want to really get ahead of you, if you really care about your people, and that's the problem. I mean, like the Army's got the big people first initiative right now.
Yeah.
And there's so many definitions of that. And I think one of the problems that the Army faced with the People First Initiative, I hope I don't get beat up for saying this, is we made it an initiative. I mean, that is our Chief of Staff's #1 priority right now. But when we started talking about people first, we really didn't define it. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
And there's a tremendous amount of interpretations and definitions and what have you out there. But the one thing that's in common is a leader genuinely has to care. If you artificially care, it's more detrimental. Just going back to looking for symptoms versus looking for crisis. That's the only way you're going to see crisis.
Yeah. Is
to have those personal relationships. I mean, they've got to trust you enough. But that's where I was going with all this. So the other thing that we don't talk about though is so what if you do intervene? Yeah. And right now if you was to go sit in somebody's annual suicide training going on right now, they're going to say, if you know somebody's going to hurt that's in jeopardy of harming themselves, to stay with the person, don't leave them alone, get professional help, call the chaplain, take them to the ER, and then we stop talking about it. That's it. But what I found out is a lot of times that's one of the most detrimental things you can do. And here's why I say that is if they have opened up to you, they've probably told you stuff that they've never told anybody else.
Yeah.
And so you go get professional help and you walk away and abandon them with a stranger that they don't have a relationship with and expect them to open up. A lot of times you're probably going to answer the mail if they're testing the water to see if anybody really cares, and you might have just answered that nobody really cares.
Yeah.
We're going to go through the motions. So I say that is if you do intervene, you own that problem till it's not a problem for that person.
That's right.
And you got to stay with them. You've got to be the rock. You got to be the encouragement to stay with getting help and treatment and what have you. And you got to be that sounding board, and you got to be there with them to assist them along that path. The old saying that addicts take their families down the road of addiction with them.
Yeah.
And when they go through recovery, they got to take their families through the road of recovery with them as well. And this is the exact same concept when we start talking about suicide prevention.
You know, it's every suicide I read about, whether it's in military and civilian world, it affects me, because you know, I think about all, and I talk about this, think about all the things, and you think about this too, Tom, had you been successful on yours, you think about all the things you would have missed out on life, right? My boys, you know, my military career, my podcast, all the people you helped destroy, all that stuff. But when you're in that moment, you don't think that way. And all I want to do, and all that I do, and before I leave this earth, is I just want, in that minute time, or that split second, I want that person to think, you know what, Sergeant Major Campbell was right, or Cliff Bauman was right, or something that we said, or something that we did snaps in their mind at that second, and they get the clarity they need to pick up their phone and call somebody, or ask for help, where I didn't. You know, my suicide attempt, if you would have interviewed my family, my brother talked about this on the Able documentary. It's the first time he's talked about my suicide attempt in 20 plus years, and I was shocked that he did. And it was hard for me to watch his interview. If you would have interviewed him and say I completed, they would argue that they didn't see any signs of me. He said there were subtle signs, but nothing that would have cued anybody in on what was going on with me. And I suspect that if you would have asked my command the same thing, they would have said the similar thing. But here's the problem with that. Let's say I completed and the Army's doing the investigation, and Tom, you correct me if I'm wrong. The first thing that those investigators are going to say to that commander is, what did you do wrong? And the commander's like, I didn't do anything wrong. I did everything that I was supposed to do. And sometimes it just happens. And when I was with the IG in the last inspection on suicide in 2020, the zero tolerance policy that sometimes goes along, you know, with the Army, when they always ask what you did wrong, when in actuality you did everything right as a commander, makes people want to be a more reactionary commander, you know, instead of a forward-thinking commander, because they're always thinking, well, if this happens or this happens, I'm going to have to do this, this, and this, instead of thinking more forward in the way they're commanding. And the Army's got to get away from that. They have to get away from the zero tolerance policy of, you as a commander, what did you do wrong? You know, what was your training records at? Let me see your training records. You know, did he miss this training? Did they do this training? Did they do that? And in reality, they should be looking at, why did the soldier feel like he couldn't ask for help, or why didn't he feel more comfortable with? And he might have. You know, I did a interview out in Oklahoma with a young commander, and he did everything. They went to the guy's house. They took his guns. He was meeting with the guy several days a week, you know, and he was in counseling. And this kid, sad to say, was just hell-bent on not living anymore, and got an excuse to go to a relative's house for the weekend and left. And they had guns at the relative's house, and he completed suicide. But that kid and that commander did everything right, by the book, everything. And then what's the first thing they ask? Well, what did you do wrong? And the kid's like,
you know, the secretary, I think it came, I can't remember now, it came, I think it's Secretary of Defense that sent out, I'm pretty sure, it might have been Sec A, but anyhow, it was a chain teach we had to do. So it was on suicide, and it came out of, and so there was a deck of slides that we had to teach off of, and it had to go all the way down to the lowest level. And so the chain teach was, the chief of staff ended up sitting down with all the MACOMs, or the major commands. They sat down with their subordinate commands, and then it just kind of trickled down. And so General Klein did it with IMT, and then just happened, that was right before I went down to Fort Jackson while this whole thing was going on. But one of those slides, though, said that 75% of suicides occur within the first 2 hours of crisis. 25% is within the first 24 hours of crisis. And I looked at it and said, man, I don't know where they pulled this data from. And I would argue that. So I do think that there is a large number that occurs within an hour of crisis, but I'd have to see the data to believe 75% of our suicides. And the reason is I've sat on a lot of suicides, or reviewed a lot of suicides. And I would argue that a lot of them is what I call the long haul suiciders.
Yeah.
I was one. And there wasn't a crisis. I mean, I didn't even have a crisis. I just had a whole lot of stressors that just kept building up.
Same here.
Until it finally broke the back.
Yeah.
But the long haul suiciders is those ones that, I mean, they deal with it, they try to deal with it, deal, and then everything just keeps piling up and nothing gets solved because they can't do it themselves. And then we start looking at artificial treatment like alcohol, in my case, that of course didn't help any, that makes it even exaggerates it. But so mine, I mean, by the time I figured out that everybody's going to be better off without me, it was still months before I actually executed.
Yeah.
And I mean, months. And just what you said, Cliff, is if you'd have talked to my family, and even now, there's still people, just literally last night, one of my former soldiers posted something that was he's having an issue. And I reached out to the guy, and we ended up linked up. Hey, and this when I was a first sergeant. And he's like, first of all, I would have never guessed that you would have got to that point in your life. Well, right. Nobody knew. When I was at that point, nobody knew about it. My family didn't know. I didn't really have many friends. I already got rid of all my friends and burned all my bridges. Yeah. I isolated myself, but nobody knew that I had a plan to end my life.
Right.
And then once I had a solid plan, then I had my sense of relief. I just didn't care after that.
Yeah. That, but with me, Tom, I don't know what triggered me that night, that when I decided I didn't want to live no more, but I didn't have a plan. I didn't have none of that. So mine was not really a spur of the moment, because it wasn't. But it's something that I had never planned until that night. And right. I don't know what this thing.
But Cliff,
scares me the most. Let me finish this real quick, and then I'll let you talk. What scares me the most, and I talk about this, I don't know what that trigger was, and that keeps me from doing certain things because I don't know what that trigger was.
Right. But in your case, it's a prime example. So we talk about crisis, and so right now, granted, your crisis was when the Pentagon attack. But how long after that was it till you finally, I mean, your mental health just finally broke down to the point of, fuck it, I'm done. It's time to end this.
15 months.
So if somebody tried to point crisis.
Right.
I mean, hell, I mean, we would have had how many thousand people at the Pentagon? That's how many people we would have had in mental health at that time.
I would say in that study, how do they define crisis? Is crisis the moment?
That's where I'm getting at.
72 hours before you completed suicide, an hour completed. We have crises that go on every single day. I mean, you could have a water leak in your house. You could have a toilet overflow. You could have a car wreck. You could have your kid wake up sick. I mean, you could have crises go on all the time. What is the crisis that you're talking about?
And that's exactly my point, is we keep saying crisis, but nobody defines crisis.
Yes. That's the first thing I thought when you said crisis. How do they define it? But, as we close up here on the podcast, Tom, I would like for you to take a couple moments and just to take a second to address the soldiers out there or family members who may be watching this podcast. If they do have that person in their life and they got that intuition or you know, if you're that person who's going through issues or problems, what encouragement or what would you tell them what they need to do right now today if they're having issues and problems as we close out?
Yeah, I'm gonna tell you, I mean, the biggest thing that I can say is if you intervene, the best thing you can do is shut up and listen, and don't make it about you.
Yeah.
Even if you experience the exact same thing that that person has, don't let them talk. You actively listen to them. And what I mean by that is, so this on first class I just talked about. I mean, I went through the exact same thing that he was going through, but I did not one time tell him, yeah, you know, I know how you feel, man. I went through that and I didn't share my story with him. I let it be about him because it was about him. So, and that's the biggest thing I say, man, is shut up and listen.
Yeah.
But then the other thing is,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to say, you know, sometimes people just want somebody to listen. You know, my wife tells me that all the time. Don't fix my problems, just listen to me for a second.
You know, yeah, I get the same treatment. But you know, and a lot of times, if somebody just comes out of the blue, just say, hey, yeah, I'm thinking about killing myself. Chances are, more than not, they do not have a plan, and they've not even really thought about how they're going to go about doing that. I mean, and I say that is why. So why do we react to it? Is if somebody comes, if they volunteered information that they're thinking about hurting themselves, they're probably testing the waters to see if anybody cares. And if you don't react to it, now you're answering the mail, and that's going to push them to the next phase of developing the plan.
Yes, absolutely.
But you know, Cliff, I want to say one other thing to listeners out there is I guarantee you people are out there listening to this that have experienced probably the exact same thing we've been talking about. Is I can't express the importance of sharing our stories, because that's the only way we're going to get rid of stigmas. And I'll be frank with you too, is and I mean, I can remember it like yesterday, and we were fishing out there by the tunnel right around. It was at the end of the tunnel, bridge tunnel, where it goes underwater on the Newport News side of the Chesapeake. And you shared your story with me. And I said, well, you know, that's funny because I've got a story kind of similar to yours. And that's the first time I'd ever told my story out loud to anybody.
Yeah, I remember that day. I get goosebumps still when you tell that.
And then I remember not long after that, you invited me to go with you over to 7th Sustainment Brigade because you're doing an LPD over there with them, with the boaties. And that planted the seed in mind of, I mean, Teresa had talked to me for a long time about, I mean, you ought to talk about your story and help others. You need to share your story. But I had a stigma against that. Yeah. I mean, I had a stigma against it and help. Well, I didn't get help. I went all the way to the brink of suicide. I finally got help. It finally worked. But then I had a stigma of people knowing that I went to the brink of suicide. I was ashamed of it. I didn't want people to know about it. I didn't want people to know that I was a mental health patient. I didn't want people to know I'm taking psychedelic drugs, right. Medicines for my mental well-being. I was ashamed of it. And so, but I saw you monopolize on it and helping people. I was like, fuck, man, if Cliff could do it, I could do it. And so I ended up, and actually the first time really publicly that I told my story was actually the video that they made, the video people over here made when they was doing the Know Your Soldier campaign, when you sicked them on the meat.
Yeah, I did. I said, you know what, I got a guy you need. They made my video. I said, there's a guy you need to talk to. That's you right under the bus, Tom, completely. But you know, that was an important.
But so I say all that is, I mean, I encourage everybody out there. If you've got a story, even if it wasn't suicide, I mean, take your pick of crisis.
Yeah.
Financial crisis, bankruptcy, PTSD, TBI, whatever.
Yeah.
Share your freaking story and help others, because somebody else is facing the same things that you're facing.
Yeah. That's true. You know, Tom, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on my podcast. I know you're a busy guy. You're traveling all the time. I look forward to us teaming up and doing a speaking event together. That's something, unfortunately, we weren't able to do before I retired, because you kept going to different duty stations. I kept going to duty stations.
Right.
But, I look forward to the times where we can get together and talk with soldiers. I think it'll be very moving and powerful. Once again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Mental Health Warrior podcast. Please go out and visit the VeteranTrashTalk.com and watch all of our podcasts. Go out to our merch store and get your t-shirts, or you can have t-shirts made. You can go out there and get your I'm a Mental Health Warrior t-shirt. I'm wearing it now. And Tom, I'll send you one of these. And it's very important to me. And on the back of the t-shirt, I had put the crisis text number. So it's a t-shirt that can actually save a life, because you never know when you walk by somebody and they look back at you, you know, that number might actually save a life. And they got counselors 24 hours a day, 7 days a week that will answer your text, whether you're a teenager, whether you're an adult, or whoever. You don't have to have insurance or anything. And so I encourage anybody, if you're having issues or problems, please, you know, text that number home, and there'll be somebody there to help you, or reach out to your senior leaders, reach out to your leader, reach out to a friend or a buddy or pal, or hell, you can message me or probably message Tom, and we'll try to help you the best that we can. Thanks again, Mental Health Warriors. Yep, you guys have a good week, and everybody take care on this month of Mental Health Month. And I would implore anybody watching this podcast, if you haven't talked to anybody, or you have that one personal friend that just kind of went quiet, please take the moment, pick up the phone and give them a call and just say hi, if anything else. Hey, everybody, you guys have a good week and take care.